Immersion is the ability of a game to transport the player into a fictional world. While this explanation is accurate, it is incomplete. According to the Oxford Dictionary, immersion simply means deep mental involvement. Of course, when it comes to video games, we bend that definition to fit our perspective. The basic concept of immersion is fairly objective and straightforward. However, when applied to video games, it becomes subjective. For me, a game that is truly immersive will not only transport the player into its world, but help the player forget the realities of their own world. The idea of finding the fictional world captivating enough to take you out of your own reality is best demonstrated in the horror genre. One of the biggest miscorrelations I've found in video game reviews is the connection of ultra-realistic graphics and mechanics to the game's ability to immerse the player. While impressive visuals can enhance a game's realism, they do not guarantee deep mental involvement or a captivating experience. It's understandable why many mainstream reviewers might consider immersion to be a sliding scale of how accurate a game is to real life. Although a popular perspective, this thought process discredits indie titles like Signalis. The tense gameplay of the small-budget horror masterpiece is significantly more immersive than many games made to look realistic. For example, the developers of Red Dead Redemption 2 clearly put a lot of effort into creating an immersive world by meticulously adding in detail to aspects of the game many players might not even come across. While this is an impressive feat of engineering, games like Signalis forces the player to be more mentally involved through engaging gameplay. The two-dimensional, pixelated horror title can feel more real when you're running away from unthinkable monstrosities. Why is this? This is the magic of immersion. And today, I hope to gain a better understanding of horror games' captivating realism. Before we continue, I just want to mention this channel will consistently release deeply researched and analytical perspectives on individual games and gaming topics. Every now and then, I try to crack jokes, but they aren't very funny, so you could just ignore those parts. If you find this content appealing, maybe subscribe and leave a comment letting me know what other topics you want me to research. If you hate the video, leave a dislike, and if you like the video, maybe leave a like. Let's get into it. One of the best horror titles, Darkwood, demonstrates phenomenal visual immersion. When you first set your eyes on the game, you might find the visuals to be quite drab, immediately noticing the small budget the game had to work with. The two-dimensional open world, barely rendered character, and subpar particle effects might put off most modern gamers. But even with these so-called faults, there are few games out there that create as terrifying an experience as the visuals in Darkwood. Why is this? Let's come back to that question after we take a look at this game. Resident Evil 3 released back in 2020 to critical and commercial failure. For the sake of staying on topic, let's try and ignore the disservice this remake did to the original. If you knew nothing about the game and simply looked at these ultra-realistic graphics, you might think this is the epitome of survival horror. The enemies are graphically stunning, and the world is created with hundreds, if not thousands, of individual assets. The phenomenal graphics might engage a player at face value, but the game is missing something to keep the player immersed. Capcom, the publisher, failed to realize one thing. Realistic graphics can only take a game so far. Visual immersion is dependent on far more factors. Resident Evil 3 lacks the visual details that truly matter, such as forcing the player to think about what could be lurking in the corner of the room rather than littering the screen with enemies that stop being scary after the initial fright. There are no visual elements in the game that ask the player to do the most important thing a horror title can ask you to do: imagine. Let's jump back to Darkwood. I started talking about this game by stating the visuals are quite drab. This is actually by design, not necessarily budget. After playing this game for a couple hours and then going to bed, you might just want to leave a nightlight on, a feeling every horror title should strive to achieve. The visuals might not be rendered in ultra-fine detail, but it does enough to keep your imagination going. Let me explain. Since this game is an isometric title, you can technically see the environment surrounding the character. Where the immersive aspect comes into play is when you realize you can only see the environment surrounding the character, not what's actually lurking in said environment. In order to see who or what is crawling around you, you have to manually make your character face that direction and point a small cone of vision towards that part of the screen. This cone of vision adds a depth to the visual aspect of the game that few games achieve even with realistic graphics. In Darkwood, you as the player are forced to immerse yourself into the setting by having to imagine what is making that devious sound. You won't get the satisfaction or dissatisfaction of looking at the creature until you force your character to look in that direction. This kind of visual horror sticks with you even after you shut off the game. Another example of a well-designed visual experience is the recently released Dead Space remake. Unlike Capcom, Motive Studio, the developers of Dead Space Remake, understood just how important visual immersion is. They took heavy inspiration from the original game and made sure not to detract too much from the original title. The mechanic which integrates the amount of health the protagonist has using only the suit is genius. Instead of taking your eyes off the main character to look at the heads-up display, the player can stay focused on the objective at hand or the enemies on screen. The original Dead Space was released 14 years ago, and while that game looked great in its time, modern hardware is capable of pushing the graphics significantly further. According to the developers, the process of improving the environments was done through a pipeline that was broken into 6 separate phases. Each phase was focused on what the development team could add or change to positively impact visual immersion. These changes included adding more assets, updating textures, improving lighting, and implementing narrative elements through visual design. Motive Studio went as far as removing any camera cuts so the player stays immersed throughout the entirety of the game. This allows for the developers to worry less about how jarring the transitions are between loading screens. Dead Space Remake is a blueprint of how most, if not all, games should approach visual improvements. If you are interested in a deeper dive into the technical aspects of the game, I have left a link in the description to a video that discusses exactly how development engineers achieved this feat. An otherwise well-designed game can lose its quality if the visual elements are not on the same level. This doesn't actually mean a visually immersive game has to have a large budget like Dead Space, since even a small indie title like Darkwood can achieve a similar level of player engagement. All that being said, visual design doesn't even hold a candle to how important auditory immersion is in the horror genre. In this next section, I will be analyzing sound, and the best way to experience this section is with a set of headphones. The visuals on screen won't be nearly as important as the last section, so feel free to just listen in. Before we take a dive into how audio design can affect immersion in horror titles, I want you to listen to the short sound clip I am about to play. As you listen, take some time to really think about what kind of emotions this music invokes. That was the soundtrack to the indie title Signalis. This soundtrack starts doing its job before you even start playing the game. The music sets a mood so that when you load up a save file, you're already feeling a sense of dread. Auditory immersion is the only way a game can pull you into its world without having to show you the world. Once you start playing, every aspect of sound design fulfills a specific purpose. Even something as simple as the sound of a door opening brings a sense of foreboding, not knowing what is awaiting you in the next room. Walking close to an enemy has another sound cue, hinting at the fact that something might be coming at you before you can visually see it. The point from the previous section of the video about how visuals can force the player to imagine also applies here. The combination of a well-developed soundtrack and unsettling sound cues can create an auditorily immersive experience. One of the scariest games I have ever played does not even have voice dialogue. This is Doki Doki Literature Club. After releasing for free in 2017, the visual novel exploded in popularity among streamers. In order for me to properly discuss the sound design of this game, I will have to mention the main twist, which occurs about an hour or two into the main story. If you want to experience this horror masterpiece for yourself, I recommend skipping ahead into the video. Okay. For those of you that stayed, let's dive deep into why this game was able to garner so much attention in the gaming community without having any real gameplay. Although Doki Doki initially comes across as a dating simulator, it's much more than that. The game starts off by setting the stage in a high school where you join a literature club. You as the player can choose to pursue one of 4 girls who are also a part of this club. One of the girls, Monica, will start getting agitated if you start flirting with anyone but her. Another girl, Sayori, will eventually reveal to you that she suffers from depression, and eventually you will find her dead in her room. This scene will cause the game to abruptly end. If you choose to relaunch a new playthrough, Sayori's text and name will be illegible, hinting at the fact that something is off. Eventually, you will start to realize that Monica is the main villain of the story, as she is the one causing these unsettling events. Towards the end of the game, the fourth wall will be broken, as Monica will start to refer to you as the player. One of the main endings requires you to quote-unquote kill Monica, which is done by deleting her file from the game's folder in the File Explorer. This radical shift from an uplifting and bright dating simulator to a dark and dreary horror title takes place quite abruptly. Since the game is more a visual novel than a mechanically deep gameplay experience, the developers had to depend on only 2 mediums to express the tone of the game: visuals and sound. The graphics are definitely impressive, especially when the game glitches and adds in layers of visual effects to break the fourth wall. However, I want to focus on the sound design, as this is where the game is more immersive. By cleverly adding in different kinds of background music during different parts of the game, Doki Doki is able to change the mood of the player. During the initial hours, you might feel excitement or joy, or maybe even boredom, depending on if you are into dating sims. This portion of the game will feature a bright and cheerful soundtrack trying to uplift the player. Slightly before the big twist, there will be sections of the game that have no music whatsoever, inducing a sense of anxiety. This only works because the game starts off with a joyful soundtrack. If the title had no music throughout the entire plotline, the impact would not be as severe. After the twist, the game will ratchet up more jarring and disquieting sounds, causing even more panic within the player. These transitions are done through masterful sound engineering, influencing how immersed the player is. Both of the examples in this section are indie titles, and while there are many high-budget horror titles that are great examples of auditory immersion, these indie projects have really perfected audio design. Since these smaller developers have had a very limited budget, they made sure to focus on the more important aspects of immersion, the parts that really matter, like music and sound effects. Larger companies pour more money into high-end graphics, deep gameplay mechanics, and other factors that might make a better video game as a whole, yet not necessarily a more immersive one. An immersive horror game does not necessarily have to involve an engaging plot. Lurking through dark hallways and exploring gloomy settings can be terrifying regardless of how deep the lore is. But this is also like saying an amazing meal does not need to be followed up by a great dessert. Sure, it's not a necessity, but it definitely doesn't hurt. 2021 was a good year for horror game releases. We had standouts like Resident Evil Village, which surpassed the expectations of many by providing a solid horror experience in conjunction with great gameplay mechanics. If you were lucky enough to have a PlayStation 5 back then, Returnal was another exceptional release, featuring fast-paced combat, which combined elements of horror in a roguelike format. Narratively, neither of these games felt quite as engaging as an underrated title called Little Nightmares 2. Before we jump into discussing the sequel, let's quickly talk about the original. Little Nightmares follows the journey of a small hooded character named Six, who's trying to escape a submarine of sorts. If the player pays attention, they can gather that this underwater vessel is a place where gluttony and corruption prevails. The human-like creatures are driven by their insatiable hunger, and the final boss is driven by power and the need for control. The game masterfully explores themes of childhood fears, powerlessness, and the loss of innocence. The puzzle-based side-scroller was released back in 2017. Since then, the title has seen a lot of success, accumulating a total sales number of over 12 million copies sold. For an indie developer with a small budget, this is an impressive figure. Critically, the game saw success as well, with top games journalists like IGN giving it a score of 8.8. The narrative elements saw praise unanimously, and channels that made videos explaining the lore gained a lot of traction. Why was this game with no dialogue or voice acting so popular? It's because the developers succeeded at one of the most important aspects of narrative immersion: creating mystery. According to J.J. Abrams, one of the main creators of the critically acclaimed TV show Lost, the concept of mystery represents infinite possibility. I will link his TED Talk in the description, but to summarize his point, mystery is the catalyst for imagination. Little Nightmares follows this concept perfectly when telling its story. The game could have given you the entire plot through narration, but instead, the player is asked to piece together a story based on the visuals and gameplay. This requires deep mental engagement, which leads to narrative immersion. The sequel, Little Nightmares 2, follows a similar style in portraying its narrative, this time playing as a different character named Mono. Mono is in a grim city, which is a distorted version of reality. This time, the player has a friend to help them navigate and solve puzzles, and this friend is none other than Six, the protagonist from the previous game. Throughout their journey, Mono and Six must rely on each other's skills and cooperation to overcome obstacles, solve intricate puzzles, and evade relentless pursuits of the monstrous inhabitants. Their bond seemingly grows stronger as they face increasingly dangerous and surreal challenges. Eventually, they will start being pursued by a thin man. The art for this enemy is similar to that of Slender Man. Towards the end of Mono and Six's journey, Six is captured by the Thin Man, and Mono has to save her. After a grueling battle, Mono manages to free Six, and both of the characters have to escape a building that is falling apart. During the end of this sequence, Mono has to make a large jump, trusting that Six will catch him and pull him over the ledge. Six does indeed catch Mono, but in a shocking twist, she betrays him by letting go of his hand and allowing him to fall into the void. Little Nightmares 2 invites the players to question the main narrative and why elements transpired in the manner they did. Players are left with a lingering sense of unease and a desire to uncover the truth hidden behind the twisted realms of the game, which might just lead them to make theories of their own or go watch YouTube videos explaining what happened. Both the first and second game expertly use the narrative structure to mentally invest the player into its lore and world design. A good narrative doesn't always have to tell you every minute detail to keep you immersed. In fact, in horror titles especially, it's better to keep the player wondering. Immersion through gameplay is not a simple task for developers. This is one of the few aspects of game design where budget might actually matter. A simplified gameplay structure can still be successful, however. It just needs to be supported by another element done well, such as music, visuals, or even narrative. In fact, a game with almost no gameplay can still be very immersive, which leads to the main point for this segment of the video. Gameplay is the least important aspect of immersion. Before you start punching your screen, let's take a look at a small indie title called Firework. This game is an outstanding example of horror done right, but the game did not receive nearly enough attention by popular game journalists. Aside from the simplistic visuals, one of the least appealing points of the game is the actual gameplay, which is probably the main reason it didn't garner much attention. Anyone who has actually played this game would know that the gameplay doesn't even matter because you are so terrified of all the other aspects of the game. Regardless, the gameplay is important to majority of gamers, so titles with a large budget make sure to heavily invest in it. The developers of Firework never wanted to appeal to the larger audience. They just wanted to appeal to enthusiasts of the horror genre. They meticulously created a polished title that immersed you through great storytelling and audio design, and kept the budget low by barely investing in actual gameplay mechanics. Okay, so bad gameplay does not equal lack of immersion. But can good gameplay help create more immersion? Sometimes. Again, only if the other elements of the game are done well in conjunction. If gameplay is somehow entangled with the audio and visual design, for example.
Verlaine?
Alien Isolation is the perfect showcase for this, with multiple elements working together to create a cohesive and immersive experience. This survival horror game is based on the popular movie series Alien. The original movie is well regarded as one of the best portrayals of extraterrestrial horror on screen. The video game does a great job of capturing the movie's environments and mood. The player takes control of Amanda Ripley, the daughter of Ellen Ripley from the movies. Amanda embarks on a mission to discover the truth about her mother's disappearance. The game takes place aboard the Sevastopol, an eerie space station in which almost no one is left alive. As the player dives deeper into the station, they will encounter a xenomorph, a seemingly unkillable alien creature which stalks the narrow corridors of the station, making survival a constant and nerve-wracking challenge. There are many audio and visual cues which hint at the alien being nearby. For example, certain ceiling vents might have a stream of what looks like drool falling from it, letting the player know not to walk below it. Audio design is also quite deep, with the developers utilizing surround sound to guide the player as to where the alien could be. If you are someone who plays with the mic permanently on, the game will even use the sound produced through the mic to let the alien know the location of the player. Utilizing visual, auditory, and gameplay mechanics cohesively, Alien Isolation is able to produce a quality of immersion no other AAA developer has been able to surpass. Often, the conversation on game immersion is focused on why it's important from the perspective of the player. Today's analysis, answered why immersion is important from the perspective of the developer. Any game creator should focus on immersion so that the player does not become emotionally detached. The horror genre is an interesting one, because only a certain type of player will approach it, someone who likes feeling the thrill of fear. Once they start playing the game, that is the main emotion the developer needs to invoke for the entirety of the game. The moment the developer stops focusing on that particular objective, they have lost the thread and, more importantly, the player. The best way to ensure the player stays engaged is through emotional attachment. Creating a visually beautiful game world, a cohesive narrative, a deep gameplay structure, and an amazing soundscape are all good goals to have, but these elements mean nothing if they don't work together to create an emotionally immersive experience.
First, I looked for a canvas. Not just any canvas. I had to find a knife. Not one of those bread ones. It needed to be as sharp as a razor. So I used a razor, in fact, and then carefully flayed the skin. Booze helped keep my hand steady.
Layers of Fear released back in 2016 and gained a lot of traction amongst reviewers. The award-winning title was a very short experience, but managed to emotionally grip its audience. The psychological horror game takes players on an explorative journey through the home of a tormented artist. Set in a Victorian mansion, the story revolves around a once renowned painter who is consumed by the horrors of his past. As the narrative unfolds, players are exposed to a metaphorical representation of his deteriorating mental state. Each room and corridor holds secrets and reveals fragments of the past, primarily focusing on his strained relationship. The environment continuously shifts and distorts, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. Throughout the game, the protagonist's obsession with completing his magnum opus becomes increasingly apparent. Players eventually discover, through snippets of articles and other clues, that the artist's wife became a victim of a devastating fire that engulfed their home. After said fire, the impact of the burns left his wife to be not as beautiful as she once was. It is revealed that the artist's wife was also his muse. However, as his obsession with this craft grew, it consumed him, causing him to neglect and mistreat her, especially after the fire. Players will eventually notice hints and remnants of the artist's volatile behavior, including broken items, torn canvases, and diary entries that allude to his growing madness and deterioration of their marriage. The title, Layers of Fear, refers to the artist's deep-rooted anxieties and insecurities, symbolized by the peeling layers of paint and the crumbling mansion. The more players dive into the artist's psyche, the more they will understand the true nature of his artistic vision and the horrifying sacrifices he made to achieve it. The fire represents a turning point in the artist's life, symbolizing the irreversible loss of his home, his heart, and potentially his wife. It further deepens his sense of personal failure and fuels his descent into madness, utilizing things like blood as paint. The game utilizes the fire as a metaphorical representation of the artist's self-destructive tendencies and the destructive forces that consume him. Ultimately, Layers of Fear is a chilling exploration of the human psyche, diving into themes of guilt, madness, and destructive pursuit of perfection. It challenges players to confront their own fears and immerse themselves through an emotional connection with the protagonist. You might not like the artist, but you are forced to feel his pain utilizing a combination of visuals, gameplay elements, audio design, and the first-person perspective. Immersion in horror games is a multifaceted experience that goes beyond realistic graphics and mechanics. While visual immersion can enhance the atmosphere and create a sense of dread, it is not the sole determinant of a game's ability to immerse the player. Indie titles demonstrate that even with limited budget and less realistic visuals, they can still deliver a truly immersive experience. Auditory immersion plays a crucial role in horror games as well, as sound design and audio effects can invoke emotions, create tension, and enhance the overall sense of dread. It is important to effectively utilize sound cues, background music, and silence to immerse the player in their eerie worlds. The use of well-crafted sound engineering can induce anxiety, panic, anticipation, elevating the immersive experience. Narrative depth adds another layer to player engagement. While intricate storytelling and well-developed narratives are not a necessity for a terrifying experience, they can definitely enhance the overall immersion and keep players emotionally invested. It is important to create mystery and invite players to piece together the story themselves. Overall, immersion in horror games is a combination of visual design, sound engineering, narrative elements, and gameplay structure. Combining these mediums, an emotional experience can be created. The ability of a game to transport the player into a fictional world, help them forget their own reality, and elicit emotional responses is not an easy task. The best horror games understand the importance of these factors and leverage them to create captivating and immersive experiences that stay with the players long after they have turned off their PC or console. By examining the games provided and understanding the various aspects of immersion, players and game developers alike can appreciate and further explore the captivating realism that horror games offer. For those of you who have stayed this late into the video, please leave a comment letting me know what made you stay. And if you have any issues with the video, please let me know that as well. I will be consistently trying to improve with every video I put out there. This particular script was a ton of fun to make, but it took me about a gazillion hours, so any feedback is well appreciated. If you really liked the video, I hope you'd think about subscribing and maybe leaving a like. There's absolutely no pressure, but this would help me grow the channel and motivate me to make more analytical videos like this. That being said, I hope y'all have a good one, and I hope to see you back here again soon.